O God, you have taught us that without love, whatever we do is worth nothing. Gracious God, please hear the words preached here today as worthy of that love. Amen. Please be seated. Well, this morning's gospel. Jesus is giving us some lessons here that are profound and demanding of every human instinct that we have. When we're in conflict with others or feeling threatened, there are two ways for us usually to respond, either flight or fight. If someone tries to hurt you or demean you or steal from you, humans generally tend to either come out swinging or head for the hills. What Jesus is teaching us is to resist those instincts, change our behaviors, and return mean-spiritedness, selfishness, and animosity by keeping our hands down and offering in return forgiveness, kindness, mercy, and love. Jesus said it, "Give and it will be given to you. A good measure pressed down, shaken together, running over will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." We take that gospel to heart here at St. James. We've done what Jesus has asked of us, even when it hasn't been easy or comfortable, standing up for justice and what is right, and giving what we can, sometimes more than we can, to those in need. We've supported ministries, both local and national. And we've also reached out internationally to ministries such as Princess Basma on the West Bank, to the Lamp for Haiti ministry, for the Lighthouse ministry, and of course, the mission to Ukraine. This morning we'll hear testimony about the Ukraine ministry that this congregation has embraced and supported in that spirit of generosity, mercy, and love. I'm going to call forward Mark Diano, our missioner to Ukraine. He will share a stewardship reflection about his life at St. James and his eighth mission trip to Ukraine that occurred this past January. It included a visit to the children orphaned by the war living in Irpin. Their artwork displayed here provides their witness and hopes for peace in their country. The artwork speaks for itself. Mark speaks for the children of Ukraine and for St. James. Mark, I'm grateful to you and happy to hand this pulpit over to you. Thank you, sir.
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
I want to thank Melissa and Audrey for giving me this opportunity to give you, the congregation of St. James, an account of our ministry in Ukraine. Some of what I'm going to talk about this morning is deeply personal, and I thank you in advance for indulging me. The story here begins in August of 2016 when I got an email from parishioner Ron Rice about the restoration of the World War II tower, and I came to do a story. I was at the Star Ledger in those days. I met Reverend Hall, and we sat on a bench outside for 2 hours. For most of that time, the conversation had flipped from me interviewing her to her interviewing me, because she recognized in me I carried a deep despair. At the end of her talk, she said the three words that changed my life: "Come to church." And that's when I embarked on two life-changing journeys. The first was an awakening of my dormant faith in the search for the peace of God in me that resides in us all. Through the church and with the guidance of Reverend Judy Baldwin, who's recommended to me by Melissa, I began to examine the causes of my unhappiness, and I identified the main culprit: a paralytic fear of loneliness. With the help of these three women priests, I finally shook hands with that part of God deep in my soul, and I lean on him daily when the dark voids try to surface. In this process, I learned that when I conquered my fear of loneliness, I conquered my fear of everything. And relative to today's gospel, this new comfort with my inherent loneliness was built on this foundation: What matters most is the love I give, not the love that I receive. Two of my children are here in the front row, and one of them is in Portugal on the Zoom. The other three will catch up with these Zoom links later. But my message to them today in this homily, and the reason that I invited them here, is to encourage them to keep a grip on their faith, no matter how tenuous it seems at times. Second journey, more brief and much less agonizing, gave me a new appreciation for my own military service, to which I never gave much thought or looked on it with any great pride, until I experienced this congregation's acknowledgement of veterans, and I recognized the intersection of the Christian and democratic values shared by both groups. Which brings us to the war in Ukraine, which challenged me to act on the culmination of both journeys. I went to Ukraine immediately after the war started as an undeterred Christian and an American veteran who believes the God-given freedoms introduced to mankind by the United States Constitution should be protected worldwide by America's broad shoulders. Our mission has been one of love and compassion for the Ukrainian people as their lives were upended by Putin's imperialistic lust. We brought food to the hungry, clothing to those inadequately sheltered in towns and villages decimated by constant Russian shelling. We bought tourniquets, 1,000 tourniquets to potentially save 1,000 lives, and trained Ukrainian soldiers in camps, clinics, a no man's land in the shadow of the Russian and Belarusian borders, and near the banks of the Dnipro River. On the other side of that river were the Russians driven across in retreat after fierce battles. The sounds of cross-river artillery was just a few kilometers away, and it reverberated through the air and at times actually shook my eardrums. In our last two trips, we also supported the children of Sanatorium Boarding School number 21, which is probably named in the Soviet times, in the city of Irpin, which was heavily damaged in Russia's failed attempt to capture Kyiv, and it's also a neighboring town of Buchka, the place where the war's first known atrocities were uncovered, where the Russians massacred 53 civilians, including 9 children. The children of School 21 are junior high age. They're all orphaned or abandoned by the war and transported hundreds of kilometers from their destroyed towns in the eastern oblast of Donetsk. They're never going to be able to return home. And the pictures that you see today were given to me on the last trip as an appreciation for their appreciation for our support of their school. 2 winters ago, my contacts brought me there during the Christmas craft show, and I noticed the girls who led me around to show me what they had made far outnumbered the boys. My gut told me the reason, but I asked anyway. Because we have a counselor who specializes in sex assault, the school's principal said. Excuse me one second. The Nicene Creed says God is the maker of all things seen and unseen, but only humans make the things that can't be unseen. The blank expressions on their faces from shock and trauma will always stay with me. More so than the abandoned remains of Russian soldiers that can only be described as a junkyard filled with burned mannequin parts that I saw in a village by the Dnipro. These men, too, are victims of Putin's Soviet-style inhumanity and reckless disregard for life, even those of his own people. Putin has come right out and said he wants to restore the Soviet Union. And as a former KGB agent, he has shown he has proven he will kill, poison, or jail anyone who gets in his way. A fact that should alarm our leaders, not extend their hand to him. I am a Cold War era veteran, and I see Putin for what he is, a godless, state-first Soviet in the tradition of Stalin, and our leaders should look no further than the 20th century Russian genocide of the Ukrainian people and the erasure of their culture before any deal is struck. Joseph Stalin starved 4 to 10 million of Ukrainians to death in the 1930s in what was called the Holodomor. Also in the 30s, hundreds of Ukrainian writers, playwrights, and artists were rounded up and executed during Stalin's Great Purge in an attempt to subjugate the Ukrainian language and culture. 280 were murdered in one day alone and thrown into a pit in a remote part of northern Russia. The soldiers were instructed to save bullets by lining them up back to back so they could kill two people with one single headshot. The population of Ukraine went from 40 million to 20 million during World War II, including millions of Ukrainians sent to Soviet work camps who never returned. The Russians blew up Kyiv without notice when the Nazis took the city, killing thousands of innocent civilians. Hundreds of thousands disappeared during secret police roundups both before and after World War II. And outside of Kyiv is the Bitkivnia forest, where as many as 200,000 executed Ukrainians are buried. Here is a historic fact. Stalin killed as many Ukrainians as the Nazis killed Jews. I once asked a Ukrainian soldier why everybody knows about the Holocaust and so few know about the Holodomor, and he answered, we Ukrainians refuse to portray ourselves as victims. I've repeated that story a few hundred times, probably 200 to my own kids. Last winter, I was in Ukraine during the Holodomor remembrance ceremonies, the most solemn day on their calendar. And in the basement of the museum, the two women I work with over there were looking up the names of their dead relatives in the dozens of the huge ledgers listing the known victims. One of them said that between the Holodomor, the murder of dissidents, the Soviets using Ukrainians as cannon fodder on the front lines in World War II, like they're doing now with the North Koreans and prisoners, and today's war, every living Ukrainian has a death in their immediate family that can be attributed to the Russians. That night, like so many others, Putin bombed the city. My final word on any potential deal made by the Trump administration that favors Putin is that it would be an insult to every living American veteran who supported the fight against authoritarian oppression around the world. Which brings me back to our memorial tower and what it stands for. That day, 6 years ago, in my 2-hour conversation with Melissa, she said, we have an obligation to remember these men and women who died in war. If we don't put a face to it, war becomes an abstraction. And when war becomes an abstraction, we forget the human beings who are dying and suffering, and it becomes way too easy to go to war. And when war becomes an abstraction, peace becomes an abstraction too. This is true more today than it was 6 years ago. And I say amen to that. Please keep the Ukrainian people in your hearts and your thoughts and your letters to your politicians. Thank you.
We did good.